Okay, this will be Emergence of the USS World Power Part 5. We'll pick up where we left off. We were looking at the writings of a naval officer who was also a competent historian named Alfred T. Mahan. And his main thesis in his books was that sea power equals world power. The nations that want to control the world have to start by controlling the sea, modeled on what Britain had done since the 18th century with a huge fleet. Okay, now, the United States specifically, as we were pointing out in the last video, is the only actual or potential world power on the planet with significant warm water frontage on both oceans. That puts us in with a unique problem. Since we have significant frontage on both the Atlantic and the Pacific, for us to be a major player in terms of naval power, we have two choices. We either would have to build two navies, one for the Atlantic, one for the Pacific, necessitated by the fact that you could not readily move units of your fleet from one ocean to the other as things stood then. You'd have to sail all the way down to the southern tip of Argentina and come all the way back the other side. And by that route, New York City to San Francisco is roughly 11,000 miles. That distance is equivalent to like almost halfway around the planet. It's not practical. So that's one option. The other option would be to find a way to build a canal big enough to handle ocean-going vessels through the narrow parts of Central America. Okay, you're thinking Panama Canal. It turned out to be the Panama Canal, and the French in the 1890s were already in the process of building what later became the Panama Canal, but they ran out of money. Disease problems overwhelmed them, and they gave it up. More on that later. But Nicaragua was another possibility, a longer route, less challenging from an engineering standpoint. So since this is an isthmus, it would be an isthmian, who made up that word, isthmian canal. Okay, allergies are all over me, I can't stand it. Sorry about that. Okay, I believe Mahan was on board for the imperialist thinking that flourished in his day. He was interested in more trade with the far western Pacific, with the East Indies, China perhaps. But the coal-burning vessels, both naval vessels and commercial ships of those days, did not get good fuel economy. They can't just go out there and come back. And of course, a steamship is much faster than any sailing vessel that would carry cargo. So he also proposed establishing what he called coaling stations. We would call them naval bases on the islands of the Western Pacific. We had one in the Samoan Islands that we set up in 1879, I think it was. But he thought there should be more. The Western Pacific is a very vast and almost empty place. So Mahan's writings fit right in with the imperialists. It takes a little bit more imagination to put the next historian into that category. He went by all three names, Frederick Jackson Turner. He was a professor of history. You know what? I'll correct myself on the screen if I'm wrong on this. I think it might have been University of Chicago. Anyways, an American historian. And one thing caught his attention when the census report came out after the census, the national counting of the population, in 1890. Okay? He knew that all the first 10 censuses from 1790 to 1880 had included a map of the United States showing where, as of that census, the frontier line was. Okay, they calculated that based on a population density per square mile. And when it fell below a certain prescribed threshold, you just connect the dots on the map and there's your frontier line. The 1890 census contained no such map, indicating that they could no longer find a discernible frontier line that they could draw on a map. That got Turner's attention. He's interested in anything that might indicate a historical shift. So he drew the conclusion, as I suppose others might have too, that the era of the frontier was over. All right, that's going to be very meaningful. So he wrote a paper. It wasn't a research paper. It was actually proposing things that others might research later. The influence of the frontier. I don't even know the name of his paper. A paper about what the frontier had meant to Americans in American history up till then. He read this paper at the annual convention of the American Historical Association in Chicago at the World's Fair, known as the World's Columbian Exposition, in 1893. Where it has it, he read it to a few sleepy historians and a whole bunch of empty folding chairs because they're all out riding the first ever Ferris wheel, things like that. But even for who was there, no single historian ever just upended a major interpretation of American history just between the time he stood up and the time he sat back down again, as Turner did on that day. His famous frontier thesis. Okay? What's he talking about here? Well, he brought to the attention of his listeners and readers that the 19th century, which was drawing to a close, had not seen any big international wars since Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, but it had seen internal stresses arising out of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. There were radical movements getting organized, that sort of thing. So Europe had teetered on the brink of class warfare as that century went by. The United States had industrialized even more than Europe had, but we skated by. We didn't have these internal stresses to anywhere near that extent. We had the wobblies and socialists and a few communists, that sort of thing, but nothing really to pose a threat. Why was that? Okay. Turner proposed, and this is not the main Turner thesis. I'll get back to that. I thought I was leaving something out. Sorry. Okay. Turner argued that the frontier had served this country the way a safety valve serves a boiler and a steam engine. Okay, this is the age of steam. You can hardly focus your eyes without seeing a steam engine. Everybody knew what safety valves did. Okay? If you just put water in a completely enclosed container and bring it to a boil, that container is going to blow up. It's just going to. So a safety valve is engineered to bleed off the excess pressure and keep it from blowing up. Well, the frontier had done that for us. Before a frustrated Pittsburgh steelworker or some other oppressed factory worker would become radicalized and take to the streets and try to overthrow the economic system, a few were doing it, nowhere near enough. They'd chuck it all, quit the job, move out to Nebraska and start raising corn. That it bled off potentially explosive social pressures. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, now I'm going to come back to that at the end of this. Turner's main thesis, and I'm sorry I put this out of order, the main thesis really doesn't have anything to do. It doesn't have anything to do with imperialism. So let me just insert this, then I'll come back to the other thing. It had always been assumed by American historians that we were transplanted Europeans and that we had adapted European culture to suit the American environment, and that the European cultural heritage was the main influence on American culture. This is going to sound like splitting hairs, but historians need something to argue about. Turner said, no, that's not right. The frontier was the formative influence, because the things about us that make us distinct from Europe are not adapted from European culture. They're products of the frontier environment. Two words, they may not be familiar to you. Americans are instinctively egalitarian. You are an egalitarian if you reject the idea that some persons or social classes naturally outrank others. Okay? How did we get to be that way? Our European ancestors weren't. When they got here, they weren't that at all. But if you consider that the original colonies were the frontier at the start, you find that the only thing matters in a frontier environment where survival is a day-to-day struggle is what you can contribute to the survival of the community. It's not going to matter to anybody who your daddy was. Nobody cares what your pedigree is. Nobody cares what title you may have had back in Europe. The only thing, it's a meritocracy, okay, that you have to be able to contribute, and from that you derive respect, and from nothing else. And ever since, we've been instinctively egalitarian. The other thing is we are, with a small d, democratic. Okay, if there are decisions being made frequently that on your welfare may depend, you're going to want to say in it. You're going to want to participate in everything. So the idea that certain wise ones should be set apart and they will make all the decisions, we're not buying that. That's another thing that came directly out of the frontier environment. These were not ideas that were brought over from Europe. Okay, now let me go back to the safety valve theory. So you put together a little syllogism here. If the availability of a frontier is what has saved us from having explosive social warfare in the 19th century, and if, as the census reports, we don't have a frontier anymore, how can we fend off class warfare in the coming century? How can we do that? Well, it seemed obvious. We need to get us some more frontiers somewhere. There's where Turner's thesis was picked up and enlisted by imperialists. The need to find new areas where we can go and expand. Now, things don't have to be realistic to influence people. As in, you're standing on the just the edge of the water on the beach at the Pacific shore on the west coast, and the warm waters of the Pacific are lapping around your feet as your toes sink gradually into the sand, and you're straining your eyes looking out across the horizon there and say, how far out there you reckon that new frontier is? Quite a ways, and Samoa is not going to be enough. It doesn't have to be realistic, but it was put together that way. Revisionist historians, who are not always bad, have not treated Turner kindly. Determining, for example, he was just running up some stuff for people to research anyway, and they did. More land was claimed under the Homestead Act after 1890, when the frontier supposedly disappeared, that had been claimed up to that point. And there was another thing. The people moving west in the westward movement after the Civil War, or any part of the century, they're not disgruntled factory workers. They're farmers. They're professional farmers. And some of them came from foreign countries. Some of them came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So it could be that Europe actually did have a safety valve, our frontier. It was just harder to get to, more expensive to get to. So the Turner thesis. I think this last question on this portion would work for us. What would becoming an imperialist country mean in terms of our historical identification with colonial populations struggling for self-determination? We had always unswervingly been the best friend and big brother of colonial populations seeking independence, freedom, self-determination. We were always the first to grant them diplomatic recognition. We were always the first to open our seaports to their shipping. We were the first colonial population to win independence and make good. And we were their heroes, role models. There were newly minted Latin American republics who spared themselves the trouble of writing new constitutions from scratch by simply translating ours into Spanish and using it. So, if we become imperialist, we will be switching sides. I'll call it off here.